Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I'm Simon from Scar Illustration, and I hope you're keeping well. Today I'm going to talk about how I start most of my paintings. As this topic is something that I could talk about at length, I decided to split the video into 3 parts so as to make it a bit easier to digest. Let's dive in. The first thing that I always do, unless I'm just sketching for fun, is to figure out what I'm going to paint. There are many ways to come up with great ideas for paintings, and my typical go-tos for inspiration are things like movies, books, comics, graphic novels, other artists' work, music, sketching, dreams, and word stacks. Word stacks are simply stacks of words that are associated with the subject you'd like to paint, which you then make connections to form new ideas. So first off, form a basic idea in your mind. Next, jot down 2 to 3 headings for the most important aspects of your idea. Under those, write down related words, and then draw bridges or connections between the words to create new ideas. Once I have a basic idea, the next step is to start planning out the painting. And for me, that means creating thumbnails, and lots of them. Thumbnails are small, quick, and simple sketches that show the basic idea with minimal details. Using this method allows me to explore many ideas quickly, instead of just settling on the first idea or perhaps one that I may have used in the past. When working on thumbnails, I keep in mind what the focal points are, the composition, and how everything fits together. I don't get stuck into any details, as this will only slow down the process and the momentum. As you can see, I'm now copying thumbnails and trying out different things such as moving the legs and repositioning the sword. I wanted to see if any of these ideas will work better in a horizontal or landscape format, but I ended up going back to the original vertical format as I felt it worked better. Still trying to get the best possible pose by changing the positioning of the legs and the head of the character. For this set of thumbnails, I opted to work both digitally and traditionally to see if I could get a little closer to what I had in my mind. Sometimes changing up the medium will give your brain a different perspective. Once I have a few that I think have legs, usually between 3 to 5, I'll clean them up and move on to some simple color studies. For the color studies, I like to work a little larger, so I can see how well the thumbnails work at a different size and to make it a bit easier for me to see what's going on. When I'm creating these, I like to keep in mind things such as the mood, the environment, time of day, color combinations, the values, the lights and the darks, and the silhouettes. I chose this particular thumbnail first as I thought it was the strongest of the bunch. For this painting, I envisaged a foreboding feel overall, and so I decided to go with a dark and muted palette. The composition for this turned out to be a classic triangular shape, and to enhance the main focal point, I placed a moon behind the head of the main character. I also decided to add some water to the bottom of the painting for more visual interest and to balance the painting overall. For the second thumbnail, I opted for a similar color scheme, but a completely different setting. I thought that the background could be either carved stone or metal. As well as that, I wanted to have a cool overhead light to counterbalance the warm browns and beiges and introduce a sense of mystery to the character. The third thumbnail is virtually the same as the second, with a slight change to the pose of the character for added strength. And for the fourth thumbnail, I went with something completely different. In this scene, I see the character as being taken by surprise, trapped, but ready to do whatever it takes to escape. As I began fleshing out this study, more ideas about the character and the setting began to develop in my mind. Oftentimes, I'll come up with a backstory about the character whilst painting. This in turn helps me to figure out what things the character might have on them, how they're dressed, and other such elements. As soon as I'd finished the study, I wrote out details to really help me cement in the main concept behind the piece. As you can see, I've added a number of things about the character, such as double knives, a sword, light body armor, even the color of her hair. I talk about the background and the stained glass window, wall carvings, the possible settings, the lighting, the color scheme, and some of the influences I may look at in order to finish the painting. Here you'll see me adding a few more details to the setting as per the text document. I'm also experimenting with different lighting options at this stage so as to make the painting as interesting as possible. At around this point, I was toying with the idea that the character was somehow a stowaway on a huge ship. As the ship pulls into the harbor of a major city, the character is discovered by chance as she is attempting to escape. But after a bit more thought, I changed the setting to a cathedral of some description. The next stage is to gather the right reference for your painting, which is absolutely crucial in my opinion. It's also the difference, in most cases, between a painting that looks believable to something that looks generic and with details that don't really add up. Every day we subconsciously take in huge amounts of detail and can very quickly spot if something is wrong. Be selective with the reference you use rather than just using any old picture, as the more information you have, the easier it will be to paint. You'll also be spending a lot less time trying to figure things out. For figurative paintings, try to shoot your own reference where possible, to complement any other references that you've found. In this instance, I took some quick reference shots of my wife with my phone with a lighting scenario similar to that of the color study. I also searched online, and I found that the stock photography sites such as Getty Images and Alamy tend to have much better photos to work from. Another great resource is Pexels, where you can download high-res photos to use as reference materials. Having the right reference is important, but don't put all of your trust into your reference material or be a slave to it. In the end, it's simply there to give you more information. Trust your own instincts on what should and shouldn't be used in the final painting. The next stage is to tackle the final sketch. After sketching the main character, using my own reference and some that I sourced online, I'm now working out how the window will look. The first window frame treatment didn't really feel right in the environment, so I quickly tried another idea which I felt worked much better. I then went and added a base color underneath the character sketch so as to differentiate it from the background and to make it easier to place the window. I'll also use this as a basis for painting the main character in the next stage of the painting. Next, I set about adding some more details to the background wall. As the setting was now to be a cathedral, I wanted to have a somewhat ornate wall with carved figures that complemented the scene. Once I'd finished the first side, I copied those figures, flipped them, and made adjustments so they looked somewhat different from the original set. I flipped the painting to make it easier to paint, and also to see if there were any glaring mistakes that I'd missed. After I'd finished those, I wanted to add some more embellishments to the wall. The first design attempt didn't really work, and so I took a portion of that and created a new pattern. I then decided to even out both sides of the window for a more pleasing look. The design on the bottom of the wall is simply a variation of the pattern by the window. Finally, I'm now making some tweaks to the main character so as to fit in better with the rest of the sketch. When I created the initial character sketch, I'd completely forgotten to add the decorative cloth hanging from her belt. After I'd completed the cloth embellishment, I decided to add that detail to other areas of outfit for continuity. Once all that had been completed, I then simplified the amount of layers and made sure that the sketch was cohesive as a whole. So there is the finished final sketch, which is now ready for painting. In part 2, I'll be going over the ugly stage of the painting process. Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I'm Simon from Scar Illustration, and I hope you're keeping well. Today I'm going to talk about the dreaded ugly stage in the painting process. Let's dive in. For this painting, I decided to tackle the value of the background straight away. The reason being is that I wanted to get a real sense of the scene. Rather than painting every nook and cranny, I found it far faster and more accurate to draw a shape with the pen tool, change that to a selection, and either paint into that or just fill the area with a color. Here I'm trying to get a sense of how the light would describe certain elements on the wall. Once that's done, it's straight into describing the carved figures, one of the more challenging aspects of the wall. At this stage, I'm just trying to give the figures some volume and indicate how the light would fall on them. This is done through a combination of looking at the reference and trying to figure out how the light would behave in this particular scenario. I'm doing the exact same thing here with the carved patterns near the window. Quickly throwing in some lit areas into the window design to see how it works with the rest of the painting. I'm also adding in some more embellishments to see how it balances from a design perspective. Back to adding more light descriptions to the pattern by the window. As you'll notice, I'm not spending a great deal of time in any one place right now or zooming in that much. I don't want to start doing a final render, as a lot of the elements haven't really been finalized yet. I found that doing that and zooming in a lot in this middle part of the painting will only slow things down and reduce the overall momentum. Plus, then it starts to feel a lot less fun and a lot more like work. Now that the background is somewhat roughed in, it's time to tackle the figure. Using the base layer that I created in the previous stage, I'll add another layer, make a quick mask, and start blocking in some colors. Again, I'm putting down the absolute bare minimum in terms of details, as I want to get the base tones down as quickly as possible. When I was younger, I would immediately start adding in a ton of detail, as I really didn't like this stage of the painting. But all too often, as the painting progressed, I would then have to go back and repaint areas, as they didn't really match up. As artists, I think we're kind of hardwired to want to create beautiful things, and spending more time in this stage seems somewhat counterintuitive. These days, I'll usually spend more time here than in any other part of the painting. This is also my favorite part of the painting process, as I can try out a bunch of things to get to the best possible result. Continuing to block in all the elements to see how the colors are working together. Now I'm adding a rough indication of how the light and shadows would fall on the figure. Same thing goes for both the knives and the sword. I'm also trying to flip the painting as often as possible, so that I don't miss any glaring mistakes. Now that the basics are all there, I flattened those layers and started painting on a new layer. I wanted to start adding a bit more movement and volume to the hair. Next, I'm going into a bit more detail with her facial features and describing how the light would fall on her face. The face is always a subtle blend of brush strokes. It never ceases to amaze me how just a few small brush strokes can completely change the way a face looks. Now I'm getting a basic look of the hands and cementing in where the light and shadows are. Hands are much like the face in that they can be tricky to get right at the best of times. Once again, I'm careful not to zoom in too much and start over-rendering at this stage. Moving on to the arm bracers, I chose to change to a chalk brush. It's always tempting to try and render everything perfectly by using the airbrush. The problem with that is that everything ends up looking like it's comprised of the same materials. In this case, plastic. Leather armor would have a different texture to that of, say, hair or skin. Using different brushes to describe various textures not only makes the painting more believable, but also draws the eye and adds visual interest. Loosely indicating the folds in her top and staying zoomed out for the most part. Part of the reason for that is so that I can see how the design is working, and if it's not, then I haven't spent a ton of time rendering something for nothing. It's also more fun. Same goes for the belts. Once again, I'm using the chalk brush to indicate the light on the leather. For the insignia on her belt cloth, I chose to use the symmetry tool to save time and so that both sides look exactly the same. I make sure to darken the figure as I move down, as I want the focal point to remain on her face and hands, quickly adding in folds and light information on her pants without going into too much detail. While I was doing that, I kept looking at the knives and thinking that perhaps the blades were positioned the wrong way around. So I changed them, and I think they read it better now. Here I am working on the design of the knives and describing how the light would fall on them. I was also looking at the sides of her face in relation to everything else, and it seemed to be a bit too large, so I went ahead and reduced it. If I'd been zoomed in, I most likely would have missed that, and then I would have had to have fixed it later on. Whilst I was working on the figure, I decided that the background wall looked imbalanced, and so I went ahead and tried to make each side match up a bit better. Of course, it's much easier to do these sorts of changes at this stage than later on once I've rendered things out a bit more. For the bottom pattern, I busted out the symmetry tool again to save time and for more accuracy. For the window, I also used the symmetry tool for iterating and cleaning up some of the lines. After looking at a bunch more stained glass windows, I decided to change the design. As you can see, I went through a number of ideas and nothing seemed to really fit. Finally, I went ahead and changed the design completely, and I think this new design works a lot better. Here you can see that I'm adding lights and shadows to suggest volume and mass to the window frame. This is actually fairly tricky to get right, and required looking pretty closely at my reference materials. I also went back to a textured brush so I could start to emulate stone for the window frame. After that, I quickly threw in some colors in some of the sections of the window. I decided to go with just a blood red color, as opposed to something multicolored, as I thought that suited the narrative better. Now I'm trying to get the lighting from the window to look somewhat realistic. Just adding some texture to the bottom of the wall. As you'll notice, I'm not being particularly careful. And the reason for that is that I want a certain energy for this painting, rather than something more cautious. Just gone back to the pattern by the window where I'm accentuating the lights and shadow. Most of the lighting in the painting up to this point has been predominantly cool, and so I decided to add a warm light to the shadow area on the figure. I also decided to carry on with that lighting in the knife blades to suggest that there are combatants just off camera with torches or maybe lanterns. So all the elements are now working together and ready for the final polish. In part 3, I'll be going over how I finish my paintings.
Hi guys, welcome to my channel. I'm Simon from Scar Illustration and I hope you're keeping well. Today I'm going to talk about the final stage in the painting process. If you missed part 1 and 2 of this 3-part series, I'll link those videos in the description below and you can go and check those out if you'd like. Let's dive in. For this stage of the painting, I decided to tackle the most difficult parts straight away, the figure. In the past, I would always opt to work on the easiest things first, and then move on to the more challenging aspects of the painting. My thinking behind that was that with a number of things already completed, there would be less pressure when it came to the harder parts of the painting. But I found that by the time I got to the more difficult things, I didn't have the same drive or energy to put into them, and the painting would suffer as a result. I also found that by overcoming the hardest aspects of the painting first, I was more inspired to complete the easier parts. As you can see, I'm now adding and refining some of the existing details. After loosely going over the entire figure, I'll then create a to-do list. This is something that I create on every painting that I do nowadays. I usually make this list after taking a break from the painting and then coming back to it with fresh eyes. In that way, I'm quickly able to see all the things that need to be finished, refined, or corrected. It's also there as a reminder so that I don't forget anything. The list is usually in order of importance and difficulty, and so I tend to follow it more or less. After getting warmed up, I go to work on the character's face first. Not only is it the most challenging part of any figure, but it's also the one area that the viewer will subconsciously look at first, and so it's important to get that right. While I'm working on the face, I'm constantly checking my reference to get the details right and any hints on lighting. As always, I'm constantly flipping the character so that my eyes don't become too used to seeing how it looks and I'm less able to spot any jarring mistakes. I'm also continually zooming in and out to see how the face looks as a whole, rather than concentrating on smaller areas. At this point, I decided to add a dark gray background behind the figure. The background wall and window is fairly busy, which makes rendering the face and hair more difficult. While I was painting the hair, I thought it might be a cool idea to add some reflections in the knife blades. An indication of who she is preparing to fight without it being too obvious. When I'm adding items like this, I'm conscious about not going too detailed, as they're just there as an added bonus and not the main event. Plus, they're relatively small, and so most of the details will be lost. Next up, I'm spending a bit of time refining both of the knives. After that, it's on to the rest of her outfit, starting with her belts. and then moving on to her sword. At this point, the sword looks a bit like a plastic toy, and so I was keen to convey a more realistic look to the weapon. Moving back onto the knives, I thought it might be cool to add some light glare movement lines. I didn't really know if it was going to work, but I wanted to experiment to see how it would look. I also wanted to break up all the reds and oranges that were already in the painting. As luck would have it, I was pretty pleased with how they turned out, so I decided to keep them. With the figure about 90% complete, I then went ahead and moved on to the background. I knew that it was going to be a challenge to get the wall and the window to look right, and so I was eager to get going on them. As with the figure, I started with the most challenging aspect, the carved figures. Coming into this stage of the painting, I only had a vague idea of the poses for these characters, and so now it was time to refine them and to get them to look a bit more believable. Whilst I'm working on the figures, I'm trying to get a sense of each of them. Once again, flipping the painting as much as possible. At about this point, I decided to move past the sketch, as I wasn't really that happy with some of the elements. Working on the hooded figure, I had a vague idea that this character would represent death and was egging on the rest of the carved figures. It's also why I kept his face mainly in shadow. As you can see, I'm now adding more details and depth to the wall, as it felt really flat to me. And then onto the details of the bottom of the wall. I wasn't entirely happy with this area either, and so I decided to spend some time refining it. For doing things like this, I like to bust out the symmetry tool, as it's far more accurate, faster, and frees up my mind to spend more time on the design. I felt that the wall tier above the carved figures was looking a bit plain, and so I first tried some simple lines, but they didn't really fit with the rest of the design. I then went ahead and tried some arches, and these worked much better. When working on the final stage of any painting, I found it's better to stay open to trying new things if the original ideas from the sketch aren't quite working. For the wall tier, directly underneath the window, I started to refine the designs using the symmetry tool once again. Zooming out, I noticed that the carved figures weren't working compositionally with the figure. So I decided to switch the first figures from each side, and that seemed to fit better overall. And finally onto the window. I think I'd been silently dreading this part of the painting, but after looking at my reference, I worked on one area at a time, so as not to become intimidated by it. When painting, it's important to not become scared by it, as this will translate into how the finished painting will look. As the wall is made of stone, I switched to a chalk brush so as to give the brush strokes a more believable texture. I also wanted the wall to look aged, so I went ahead and added some cracks here and there. I noticed that the window seemed a bit off positionally, so I moved it accordingly. From there, I moved on to rendering out the rest of the window. The light coming through the window seemed a bit flat and uninteresting, and so I decided to experiment with some beams of light. It's not exactly the most original lighting element, but it is effective and adds drama nonetheless. I filled in the red stained glass areas of the window a bit more as they felt unfinished and cleaned up the edges. I then experimented with different gradients and some subtle textural effects. I don't normally use the textures that are built into Photoshop, as I don't really like them, but I think they work when used as a subtle effect. Now it was time to start adding some of the reflected lights. I envisaged that the characters that were facing the main character would be carrying candles or torches, and that light would need to be described on the wall elements. To add more interest to the focal points, I darkened the edges of the painting. Next up, I spent time just refining some of the areas on the figure. After that, I then added some broken colors to the shadow areas to add interest. In this case, I added a blue color to balance all the red and orange tones. And that's how the process of this painting came together. Hey, I'm Simon from Scar Illustration, and here's a quick tip on finishing your paintings. First, I'll add a layer, fill that with black, and reduce the opacity to something like 50%. Then I'll add a text layer and start adding items to my to-do list. The list is always different depending on the painting, but it's typically comprised of a few key elements such as brushstrokes, broken color, and reflected lights. I'll usually make this list after taking a break from the painting and then come back to it with fresh eyes. In that way, I'm quickly able to see all the things that need to be finished, refined, or corrected. My to-do list is usually in order of importance and difficulty, and as such I tend to follow it. It's also there as a reminder so that I don't forget anything. Once the list is complete, I'll add another layer which I'll then use to add lines to cross off all the items as I complete them. I tend to group all three of these layers so as to make the things a bit tidier. I hope this was helpful. Please consider liking this video and subscribe to my channel. Have a great day and keep on painting! Hi guys, welcome to my channel. I'm Simon from Scar Illustration, and I hope you're keeping well. Today I'm going to talk about how to create a painting study. Let's dive in. I'm currently working on a book cover commission that requires a cave background. As I haven't painted that many caves, I decided to go ahead and create some studies, and this is the first of those. My younger self would never bother doing these. I would always think that it was a waste of time that could be better spent on the final painting. But I've found that not only does this give me more visual vocabulary to work with on the sketches and the final illustration, it also takes away some of the pressure and subconscious stress that builds up when I'm tackling something that I'm not that familiar with in a professional setting. Not only that, but a fair number of the old masters would do these types of studies. And if I can get my paintings to look half as good as their finished works, then I'll make the time to do these studies. The first thing that I do is to find some reference photos of what I'd like to study, which in this case is a cave interior with a shaft of light from above. Photo sites such as Getty Images and Alamy tend to have better examples than, say, just a simple Google search. They also have a better filtering system than Google, which can save time. Once I have several examples of what I'd like to study, I'll then choose one and create a new document that has roughly the same dimensions as the photo. Rather than just rushing headlong into the paints, I like to map things out with a quick pencil sketch first. I realize that it's just a study, but I've found that this method really does save me some time down the road, as there tends to be a lot less repainting involved. It's also a good warm-up for both my eyes and my hand before I start the actual painting. As you can see, I'm measuring elements in relation to other areas so that everything is somewhat correct. For some reason, I've always found it easier to get things correct in traditional media than digital. Thankfully, it's super easy to change things on digital paintings. I don't tend to go into too much detail with the sketch portion of a study, nor do I spend much time close up either. I'm more interested in getting something that looks convincing as a whole as opposed to a photoreal rendering. Once the sketch is complete, I'll start throwing down some paints. I like to use a larger soft brush for this, as I can cover a lot of ground quickly without committing to any particular shapes or patterns. I'm also constantly looking at my photo reference. It's so easy to start spending more time looking at your sketch rather than the reference, but I found it's better to do the exact opposite. As I'm painting rocks predominantly, I've switched over to a chalk brush. The chalk brush will give me more of a dry brush look and feel to the rocks, which is what I'm after, rather than something soft like an airbrush. Even though it's just a study, I still like to incorporate believable textures in my brushwork. I'm also constantly turning on the sketch layer to make sure that I'm in the right place, as well as flipping the painting to ensure that everything looks correct. The figure is pretty much the only part of this painting where I zoomed in. And the only reason I did that was because the figure is quite small and I wanted to get the main shapes correct. Now I'm starting to work on some of the silhouettes and atmospheric lighting. I'm also careful to add these very subtle color shifts to the atmospheric lights, which I've observed on the reference photo. I'm also starting to develop the tonal range of the study by putting in some darker tones with the foreground rocks, as well as adding textural effects to wherever the light falls, whilst keeping in mind this quote: "Light is for texture as shadow is for form." I can't remember exactly which artist said this, but I found it to be very effective despite its simplicity. When I'm working in the shadow areas, I'm careful to add very subtle tonal shifts to suggest details, still staying zoomed out for the most part, as I want to keep the momentum going with this study rather than getting bogged down with a ton of details. As I reach the end of this study, I just want to mention something.
and that is that a study doesn't need to have the same level of finish that a final painting would have. Many times in the past, I would have spent a long time over my studies as I wanted them to be perfect. I would get bogged down in all the details, put way too much pressure on myself, and this would discourage me from doing them. But now, I treat studies as I would a sketchbook, something I can create relatively quickly in order to get some of the visual vocabulary I need for a particular purpose, and also a trial run before I start in on a final painting. Thus, I find creating studies to be both rewarding and relaxing at the same time. Hope this was helpful, and let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Please consider liking this video and subscribe to my channel. Have a good one, and keep on painting. Hi guys, welcome to my channel. I'm Simon from Scar Illustration, and I hope you're keeping well. Today I'm going to talk about creating art to send to a specific company that you'd like to work with. Let's dive in. So with this painting, there's a bit of a backstory, and I'm going to date myself here. But back in the 90s, I had some interest from a few companies, and one of which was Wizards of the Coast. I met with one of their then ADs at a comic convention, and after looking at my portfolio, requested that I create some more samples and then send those in. Once home, I immediately started creating some more samples as I really wanted to start working with them. But at the time, I was struggling financially, and so I took a job with a local publisher as an in-house illustrator. Being young and naive, I figured I could put creating samples on hold and get back to them later, but I let this chance slip by. And ever since then, I've regretted that decision. Fast forward to around 2015, and the hankering to create work for Magic the Gathering hadn't gone away. If anything, it had only intensified. So I sent in a few paintings that I thought they might be interested in. The problem was that I didn't really do enough research on the type of work they were commissioning at the time. And unsurprisingly, the work was all rejected. And I thought that maybe I just wasn't cut out to be a magic artist, and that ship had sailed. So I continued on my quest to become a book cover artist, which I've been moderately successful at. But late last year, I was on the Muddy Colors blog and happened across an article by Wiley Beckert entitled Creating a Targeted Illustration Sample, where she breaks down how to do just that. The article was well written, insightful, helpful, and I would definitely recommend reading it if you get the chance. After reading the article, and with some encouragement from my peers, I decided that I would start creating some new paintings that were specifically targeted for some of the companies I would like to work for, which includes Wizards. And this painting is the first of those targeted illustrations. The first thing I did, which was also recommended in Wiley's article, was to compare how some of my current work stacks up against recent Magic card illustrations. Luckily for me, my work and choice of subject matter tends to be in a similar vein, although stylistically there would need to be some adjustments, such as making sure that the focal point was an easy read at a small size. As well as that, most of my work is in a vertical format, which works great for book covers, but this new painting would need to be in a horizontal format to match the space requirements for Magic cards. The second thing was to come up with a sample prompt for the mock commission. I have plenty of experience working with book publishers' commissions, but as I haven't worked with Wizards of the Coast, I decided to look online to see what I could find. And lo and behold, about 30 minutes later, I had not one, but a number of sample card assignments that I could work from. After rereading all of the samples, I decided to go with something relatively simple and familiar so as to make things a bit easier to start. Here's the sample illustration I went with. Color, black spell. Location, shadowy woods. Action, male humanoid figure covered in leather armor with some metal, wearing a large hooded cloak. The hood is on and covering his face. His gear should be typical assassin, but instead of small weapons, he should have a large sheathed sword. The viewpoint should be first person, as if you felt like something was watching you and turned to see this figure. Focus, the figure. Mood, menacing and hostile. As you'll see, I decided to deviate somewhat from the description, but all the main points are all there. The next stage was pretty much how I approach any of my work. I created some rough thumbnails, and from there distilled down to the strongest ideas and then created some color roughs from those. I spent a fair amount of time analyzing how other artists had framed similar characters and kept that top of mind when I chose the final idea that I went with. I also grabbed a sample card online and placed each of the color roughs into the space allotted for the illustration to check which one was going to work the best. Paying close attention to crisp silhouettes, design, and filling the frame with the most important aspect of the picture. After that, I collected reference materials and also took my own reference photos for the character with a general idea of the lighting needed. This usually tends to be somewhat time-consuming, but in my experience it's definitely worth it. There's nothing worse than having to stop and look for reference halfway through a painting, as that tends to break the momentum, and so I like to avoid doing that if at all possible. Once I had gathered all the info I needed, I then created a final sketch which would serve as my roadmap to the finished illustration. I like to stay fairly close to this sketch, but as the painting progresses, I'm always open to changing anything if I think it would serve the final illustration better. In this case, I went back and forth on the face of the character before finally settling on a particular look. I also moved the sheath's dagger as it wasn't really working where it was in the sketch, and I think the new position makes for a more interesting silhouette. Finally, I added some custom designs to the daggers, sword, belts, tunic, and pauldrons. With this sample illustration, I wanted to incorporate all the things that I imagine Magic is looking for in a card illustration. Saying that, I also wanted to put my stamp on it and not simply blend in with a lot of their current roster of artists. With that in mind, I've added textural brushstrokes and effects so as to give the painting a more traditional feel rather than going for a perfect airbrush-like rendering, which I've never been a huge fan of. I'll be sending in this sample illustration for consideration, and in the meantime, it's time to get started on the next sample. Hope this was helpful, and let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Please consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel. Have a good one, and keep on painting. Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I'm Simon from Scar Illustration, and I hope you're keeping well. Today I'm going to talk about a recent master study and why I think they are a valuable tool for learning. Let's dive in. Lately I've been feeling that my work is somehow lacking. The lighting, gestures, and brushwork were all starting to look a bit tired. So I decided to do a master study to change things up a bit. And not just any master study, but a study of a painting by an artist who is arguably still the best digital painter in the world, Craig Mullins. Now I decided to do a master study of Craig's work for a couple of reasons. The first being that his work is radically different from mine, and I knew I'd be able to learn a ton of things. And the second is that a lot of my work tends to be really tight with lots of details, and I'd like to move towards a more painterly and looser style with my own work. As you can see, I started with a basic line drawing so as to get the proportions correct. But before I started that, I made sure that my canvas was the exact same dimensions as the painting that I was working from. This makes it much easier to get all the measurements somewhat in the same ballpark. I always think it's a good idea to choose an artist that you really gel with when doing studies such as this, especially if you're going to be doing a full study, which can take anywhere from 6 to 20 plus hours to complete. Which is another reason why I chose to do a study of a Craig Mullins painting. The goal with master studies is to really try to understand the painting as a whole, and at least some of the decisions that the artist made when they created the original. The techniques, colors, composition, proportions, and brushwork, so that you can then translate some of those elements into your own paintings. I always take my time when creating studies like this so that I can get the most out of them, with an emphasis on accuracy rather than speed. As you're doing these primarily for yourself, there's no need to crank through the study at breakneck speed. Plus, the fact, in most instances, the artist would have taken some time to complete the original, and so it's somewhat unrealistic to expect to complete a study of that same painting in a couple of hours. Next, it was on to tackling the main figure. I threw down a basic tone, added a layer on top of that, and made that layer into a quick mask. I find this method works well for me, so I don't have to worry about my edges when I'm starting to paint certain elements. Once I have everything basically blocked in, I'll usually flatten those layers and paint on top of them. Then I started moving away from the mid-tones of the figure by adding slightly darker and lighter tones. In the past, I would always put down the lightest lights and the darkest darks first, so as to give myself a tonal range. But I found over time that I tend to get better results by slowly building up the colors instead. Over the last few years, I haven't really made the time to do that many master studies. But when I do, I always learn something useful, be it color choices, textural effects, or simply how to paint particular elements a bit better, which I then subconsciously add to my own work. Another reason why I think that doing these types of studies is important is that it increases your visual vocabulary, so that you can more easily problem solve aspects of your own work, and or come up with ideas and concepts that you might not have before doing the study. Artists have been creating master studies for centuries, and for good reason. They're a great way to improve at a relatively fast pace. They also allow you to concentrate on specific things such as rocks or anatomy, without having to worry about composition, lighting, and a whole host of other things that you have to think about when you're creating something from scratch. When it comes to choosing a painting, make sure to get the highest quality image possible, as this will make it much easier to see what's going on and for getting the colors accurate. If you're doing a study of a traditional painting, I'd also recommend trying to see that painting in life if possible. I've been to quite a few galleries over the years and stood in awe in front of an original masterpiece. The colors, textures, and in some cases the sheer size of the paintings can be pretty mind-blowing. And then afterwards, whilst leafing through an art book or online days later, I'll be looking at the same painting and be dismayed at the vast differences between the two. So with this study, I really wanted to get into the brushwork and expressiveness of the piece, as that's one of the things that I really admire about Craig's work. With regards to this painting, there's a lot of suggested details, which I think is far more interesting and intriguing than if those areas had been tightly rendered. Many times in the past, I would laboriously render something, only to find that it really didn't add that much, if anything, to the finished piece. The fact is that I just wasn't confident enough in the painting or my abilities, and so felt the need to over-render areas that were not the focal point to simply make myself feel better about it. Whereas Craig's brushwork is far more suggestive and efficient, which in my opinion is just simply more interesting. The other thing that I found challenging with this study was actually trying to emulate certain textural brush strokes. I've got a ton of brushes, most of which I rarely use, and I found that there were times where I was having trouble matching or even getting close to what was in the painting. And because there's a loose and almost impressionistic aspect to this painting, the shape language had to be spot on. I found that difficult to nail down in some areas of the study, and something I could certainly improve on in my own work. Once I'd gotten everything in the relatively right place, it was time to start working on the subtleties of the piece. When I started working on the face of the character, it became apparent that some of the brushstrokes almost felt like a beautiful charcoal drawing, or even a cross between a J.C. Leyendecker and Drew Struzan painting. And this is especially apparent in the eye, nose, and cheek area of the painting. I was also trying to get some of the same textures that the original piece has by using a variety of different texture brushes, as I really like that aspect of Craig's work, and I like to include more of in my own paintings. Creating this study was really challenging, but fun and informative at the same time. It's great seeing how Craig handles certain aspects of the painting and how he describes light. I particularly enjoyed trying to emulate the impressionistic handling of the character's costume, as well as all the textural effects that Craig employs in his work. Hopefully this painterly and expressive style will translate into more of my own work down the road. Hope this was helpful, and let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Please consider liking this video and subscribe to my channel. Have a good one, and keep on painting. Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I'm Simon from Scar Illustration,
and I hope you're keeping well. Today I'm going to talk about how I created the portrait from my assassin painting. Let's dive in. I started by filling in the area of the face with a flat color that was roughly the overall skin tone. I thought that perhaps the character would be outside a fair amount of the time, so I wanted to give him a slightly weathered look. Next, I set about putting down some of the darker midtones. I wanted to get a sense of the dimension of the character's face and features right from the get-go. I then started progressively adding in darker tones for the shadow areas, such as under the eyebrows, the nose, the bottom lip, cheekbones, and the chin. I used to start off by putting in the darkest darks and the highlights first, but I found that I get much better results by slowly building up to those tones. Next, it was on to the lighter areas. The face felt a bit long and thin, so I started filling out the sides somewhat. I entertained the idea of perhaps giving the character sideburns, but decided against it in the end. As the character is wearing a hood, I went ahead and added that shadow before I got too far ahead with the rendering of the face. Initially, I went with a fairly dark brown color, but later on changed the color to a more of a mid-red color. I then changed the layer to multiply and reduced the opacity. I found that this effect will give me the most realistic looking shadow. As the character is on a slight angle, I rotated the canvas to make it a bit easier to get the proportions of the face correct. Just adding a subtle red tone to the nose now. Typically, the nose, cheeks, and ears will have a slightly redder tone to them. I also added a blue-gray tone to the jawline to suggest some stubble. Now it was time to start developing the features of the face and adding some more definition. I added some scars to his face to support the character's backstory or narrative. I like to create backstories for all of my characters, as this will tend to inform some of the design choices. I went back and forth on the eyes a few times as I wasn't really happy with how they looked and their relative positioning. For some reason, they just kept on looking cross-eyed to me. As always, I'm continually zooming in and out to check that everything fits together. Now I'm adding some highlights to the nose and the top lip. For the highlights, I usually like to use a brush that has some texture. This is a quote from Howard Pyle, which I've found really helpful. Lights define texture and color. Shadows define form. Turning the shadow layer on and off continually, as well as the sketch layer to check that the painting hasn't veered too far off course. Now developing some of the shadow areas. Softening some of the planes of the face. Also adding in some subtle red tones as the planes turn away from the viewer, and doing the same thing with the chin and jawline with the subtle gray-blue color. On to developing the lips. I find painting lips to be a challenging area of the face to get right. There's lots of different angles and details in such a small area. Bouncing around the face as I see areas that need work. Adding highlights to the top of the lips now. And back to the eyes. Trying to straighten out the pupils somewhat. Once again, turning on the sketch layer to check how things are going. At this point, I was concerned that the face was still looking too long and thin overall, and not how I envisaged the character. So I started filling out the size of the face and accentuating the jawline some more. I also increased the space between the nose and the mouth, as well as shortening the nose.
The mouth still seemed a bit too wide, so I shortened that as well. I then flipped the painting to see what areas needed work. As it happened, the whole face seemed to be sliding down to one side, so I went ahead and fixed that by adjusting the angle of the nose, chin, and eyes. I also filled out his neck as well. And then it was on to developing the character's furrows. After zooming out, I noticed that the face seemed a bit too big for the hood area, so I reduced it a bit. I then turned on the shadow layer and flipped the painting to check how it was all looking. I still wasn't happy with the character's right eye, so I duplicated the left one, flipped it, moved it over, which seemed to do the trick. At this point, I was starting to feel that the face was getting closer to what I had in mind at the start of the painting. Just going over the highlight areas of the neck and the face with a chalk brush for texture, and using a softer brush for the shadow areas. It was finally time to zoom in and take care of some of the smaller details. The first thing I tackled was the eyes, as I always tend to notice those first when looking at a portrait, and then darkening off the bottom of the face. Flipping the painting again, and darkening off the jawline a bit more. Smoothing out some of the dark areas so they don't look too sharp and unrealistic. Still repositioning the eyes, as they look slightly off when I flip the painting. Correcting the shadow edge as it was too short. Adding some more texture into the highlight areas. Finally, I added some saturation and lightened the entire portrait. With this portrait, I wanted to convey a sense of foreboding and menace, whilst giving the impression that the character was a seasoned professional. Hope this was helpful, and let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Please consider liking this video and subscribe to my channel. Have a good one, and keep on painting. Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I'm Simon from Scar Illustration, and I hope you're keeping well. Today I'm going to talk about how I came up with this creative sketch and the benefits of creating these types of sketches. Let's dive in. Whenever I start on these types of sketches, I usually have no set canvas size or orientation in mind. It's all pretty random, and I'll just get started rather than overthinking anything. I can always change the canvas dimensions if I think it will serve the idea better later on anyway. Usually, I'll sketch out a few things before anything sticks. Case in point, this was actually my third idea. At this stage, I'm just looking for interesting shapes and patterns that I could maybe turn into something. Once I've got the basic idea, I'll then start throwing down some colors and see what happens. I'll also reduce my layers to the bare minimum as well. After the colors, I'll start thinking about the lighting that I want. And for this one, I decided to have some sort of light vortex in the background, as well as an overhead light. Then it was on to working on the main character and the vehicle. I usually like to do this in monotone, as it makes it easier for me to just concentrate on the design rather than getting distracted with colors. Once I was somewhat happy with the general shape of the main character, I then moved on to fleshing out the world a bit more. While I'm doing this, I'm trying to come up with some sort of backstory that will better inform my choices. In this case, I was thinking that there was once a thriving port city that had since been abandoned after an invasion. And the main character, who was part of the original invading force, was on the hunt for survivors. Now I'm trying to solidify some of the lighting and other details to support the narrative. As you can see, I'm working with very few layers, and this was done on purpose for a few reasons. 1, I wanted to have a more traditional feel. 2, I didn't want to fuss around with layers and invariably forget which layer I was on. And 3, I wanted there to be a certain energy to the sketch, which I find tends to get lost on pieces where I have a zillion layers. I then started trying out different color variations for the background, to get away from my default color choices. After that, it was time to start nailing down some of the shape design on the main character. As you can see, I tried a bunch of things before finally settling on an idea. For the flying vehicle, I kind of envisaged a cross between a snowmobile and some sort of Harley-esque style motorcycle. When I was working on the main character, I kept going back and forth on whether or not it was going to be a droid, a creature, or human. In the end, I went with a combo, a sort of RoboCop type of character. Then it was on to adding some more details to the bike. Just working on some of the lighting on the main character now. I wanted to highlight the character and the left side of the bike, and so I added a red tint. It's not realistic or terribly correct lighting-wise, but that's one of the points of creating sketches like this, to just try out a bunch of things and have fun with it. After that, it was time to get back to the background and start adding some more details. When I was younger, I wouldn't spend much time on the backgrounds in my paintings. In my mind, once I was happy with how the character looked, I just kind of lost interest in the rest of the painting. I've since done a complete 180, and now I treat the background as another character. And I've found that I actually enjoy fleshing out the world as much as the characters now. As you will see, I'm spending a lot of time zoomed out of the painting. Not only does this speed up the process, as I'm not tempted to noodle on all the details, but I also get a sense of the whole painting at the same time, which makes it easier to make better choices, and I'll end up with a more cohesive sketch. With that said, I then decided to get rid of the structure on the right side of the painting. I felt it was competing with the main character too much and leading the viewer's eye away from the focal points. Then it was a case of replacing the structure with some rocks to suggest depth, and adding some more details to the water areas. I then moved on to the clouds. I wanted to give the impression that the light vortex extended far into the distance, so I added details to suggest depth, whilst flipping the sketch to see how it was all looking. After that, I started moving the character around, changing the dimensions so that it fit better with the scene. I also added some other characters to suggest some sort of squadron rather than just a solitary rider. With the secondary character, I changed the arm and the head position, as well as muting the colors and contrast to suggest distance. I then repeated that process for the third character. Once that was done, I added another layer, filled it with black, and changed the blend mode to color, which I do to check my values. It was at this point that I realized the painting was looking a little flat, so I then added some shadows to the rocks in the middle and on the left-hand side of the canvas. Creative sketches are an opportunity to try out some new things, such as lighting, characters, styles, and color combos that I wouldn't necessarily paint on my professional commissions. They are also important for flexing my creative muscles and coming up with new ideas and techniques, which then in turn bleeds into my other work. I also like doing these as a nice break from my finished work, as I can finish them relatively quickly. There's no constraints or pressure, and they're just fun to do. Hi guys, welcome to my channel. I'm Simon from Scar Illustration, and I hope you're keeping well. Today I'm going to talk about leveling up your art skills and some of the ways I did that with my most recent painting, and welcome home. Let's dive in. This illustration is based around a painting that I created some time ago entitled The Return. The story is about a prince that returns to his father's kingdom after many years in exile to exact his revenge. In the original painting, the main character, Revan, is entering the realm of his father's kingdom. And in this follow-up painting, he's made his way through the outer defenses of the kingdom killed all of the palace guards, is now confronting his estranged family at dinner, much to their surprise, shock, and horror. The first thing that I decided to do was to seek some guidance in the form of a mentorship. And in this case, that was Smart School. I've considered taking a Smart School course for many years, but to be honest, the upfront cost and the times of the classes were things that put me off in the past, as well as the fact that the classes are not recorded. But I knew that if I really wanted to see a change in my work, then I would have to change how I was doing things. So I decided to invest both the money and the time into addressing those changes and to move forward with my art. I headed on over to the website, looked through the mentorships that were on offer, and chose the one that seemed to be the most suitable for me. Unfortunately, the times of the classes were PST, and I'm currently living in Slovakia, which is Central European time, which meant the class times for this course were going to be kind of brutal. And I was right, as they ended up being from 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. But, as the old saying goes, no pain, no gain. For this illustration, I really wanted to create something more in-depth and lifelike than my previous pieces. So, first off, I spent a lot more time considering the storyline behind the painting. I worked out things such as the character's motivation, the action, the setting, time of day, and the secondary characters in the scene. Once I had a specific scene in mind, I then created a set of rough thumbnails to really support that narrative, which I created both digitally and traditionally. While I was drawing the thumbnails, I was also thinking about how to make the painting as impactful as possible, whilst keeping in mind the narrative of the piece. The second thing I did was to put together a detailed inspiration board. I always create a reference board to support every painting that I do, but this one had a bit more to it. On the board I included images to support the mood, the characters, the motion of action, the setting itself, and interior items that I knew were going to be needed. These images proved to be invaluable as I moved through the creation of this painting, and they kept me anchored to my original vision for the piece. After that, I reviewed all the thumbnails and really honed in on the ones that I thought were the most successful. I then took those and developed them a bit further so as to see how everything might work together. Again, I spent more time than I would normally crafting all the elements so that they would be cohesive and look believable. Next, I chose the two strongest thumbnails and created both a value sketch and a color sketch for each of them. I took my time rather than rushing through them so as to really cement in all the elements. Creating the value sketch was another step that I wouldn't normally do, but it really helped me to see how the light might work in the scene. And from there, it was easy for me to pick the most impactful idea. After I had finished with the sketches, it was time to shoot the reference. And here's why I again diverged from my usual process. As the setting was an interior scene, and to get the light as realistic as possible, I went ahead and created a crude diorama or model of the scene. This required grabbing some cardboard from recycling, constructing as much as possible, and utilizing a small anatomical model that I had lying around. I considered trying to do this all in 3D, but instead, as my 3D skills are limited at best, I opted to go the old school route. By the way, this technique is thoroughly explained in James Gurney's book Imaginative Realism: How to Paint What Doesn't Exist. If you hadn't read the book, I highly recommend doing so. There were quite a few challenges in creating this scene. The first one was trying to get the lighting to work. and the second was to somehow create the fabric trail of destruction behind the main character. On my first attempt, the lighting just wasn't working, and as a result, all the reference shots were somewhat unusable. For the interior, the light was too face on, and consequently a lot of the details were blown out. For the figures, I tried to utilize some of the window light in my apartment. Unfortunately, this didn't produce the results that I was after either, and I was forced to try something else. And by that I mean I decided to finally get serious about how I go about creating the lighting for my reference shots. And this is where the Smart School course came in really handy. After my mentor reviewed my initial reference photos, she suggested that I should bite the bullet and invest in some lights, as this is a constant sticking point in my process. I mentioned in previous videos that creating the reference shots for my paintings is my least favorite part of the illustration process. And the reason being is that it's time-consuming, frustrating, and rarely gives me the results that I'm after. So with that in mind, I decided to take my mentor's advice to make the whole process easier, more efficient, and a lot more useful. After scouring the internet, I ended up getting a softbox studio light with a stand, a smaller secondary light, and a tripod. I also opted to shoot most of the reference with my DSLR instead of my 6-year-old iPhone, so as to get more fidelity in the photos. I found that the photos I shot in low light on my phone ended up being far too grainy to be useful, as well as out of focus in some cases. I then blocked off all the windows where I was shooting the reference with some more cardboard, just so that I could fully control the light. From what I understand, many artists actually choose to shoot their reference at night for this very reason. But I opted to do this during the day, as I knew that it would take some time for me to get it right. And I didn't want to be messing around trying to get these shots right at 3 AM. For the fabric, one of my fellow classmates suggested getting some paper towels and covering them in wax so I could shape the fabric appropriately. I tried this technique, but it wasn't quite working for me. Instead, I grabbed an old handkerchief, added some water, waited for it to dry a little bit, placed it in the scene, and molded it into the stairs, so as to give the impression that the fabric was heavy with blood. This seemed to have the desired effect and gave me a lot of very useful information. The rest of the elements were a combination of paper towel rolls for the columns, cardboard silhouettes for the secondary figures and table, and the weapons on the back of the fabric in the foreground were just cardboard cutouts covered with tinfoil. Once I had the reference shots that I needed, I spent time reviewing them all and putting them together in one document. I then painted over certain elements to get them as close as possible to how they would look in the final painting. After reviewing this revised version of the reference comp, I was given a very enthusiastic green light by my mentor. The preliminary work for this painting took much longer to create than my usual process. Consequently, it was now the final week of the course and my last chance to get feedback on the finished painting. So I decided that I was going to finish up the painting before the final class. Normally, this stage of the painting would still take me some time to finish, because there were a lot of holes in the information from my ref shots, which required a fair amount of mental math. This in turn would add a lot of extra time to the process. But in this case, as I'd spent considerably more time on all the back-end elements and had way more information than usual, I was able to breeze through one of the most complicated paintings that I've ever created in record time. I'm not saying that it was easy, but it was a lot easier and faster, but not super quick. There were still a few late-nighters, and not a lot of sleep in the 6.5 days it took me to complete the painting. In the end, not only was I able to finish the illustration, I was able to create my most realistic and in-depth painting to date, and one that I'm very proud of. In order to level up my skills, I recognized that I needed to change things up. And for me, that meant seeking some help in the form of a mentorship. My key takeaways from the mentorship were getting really useful feedback on my work, advice on all aspects of the illustration process and business, process tips and tricks, working on my weaknesses, having my work critiqued by a prominent art director, encouragement by my mentor and other classmates, auditing another Smart School class, and finally, a sense of community. The process wasn't easy, and at times was pretty painful, but in the end, I think all the hard work was so worth it. Hi guys, welcome to my channel. I'm Simon from Scar Illustration, and I hope you're keeping well. Today I'm going to talk about how you can create accurate drawings for your paintings by using techniques that I've developed over many years. This method is suitable for both digital and traditional mediums. Let's dive in. The first thing I do is spend a couple of minutes just looking at my reference. And in this case, it's a photograph. When I was taking photographs for this study, I knew that I wanted some sort of dramatic lighting so as to get a good framework for an interesting painting. Once that's done, I'll then move the photo to the side and create a canvas that's either the same size or dimensions as the photo. Next, I'll throw down the first marks to establish where the object is in space. In these initial steps, I'll stay away from using curved lines and just stick to straight lines. This makes it a bit easier to get things in the right place, and I can worry about putting in all the curves a bit later on in the process. Once I have a few brush marks down, I'll then go back to my photo and start putting in some horizontal guidelines. These will help me pinpoint exactly where things are instead of where I think they are, because generally what I think is right is actually wrong in reality. I'll then line up those guides on my canvas so that they match with the photo. When I'm doing this, I'm paying close attention to my angles and distances, as these things become more important and evident as the drawing progresses. If I was doing this traditionally, I would start with a rough shape, so I can get a sense of the overall dimensions. And then I'll add in some guidelines and base my measurements off of those to inform how the rest of the drawing will be laid out. Whichever method I'm using, I make peace with the fact that there will always be a bit of redrawing in order for me to get things to where they need to be. And in the case of digital work, I'll use the transform tool if I feel something isn't quite right. Once I have some of the horizontal lines down, and I've roughly established some of the areas, I'll start indicating the vertical guidelines. Again, I'm paying close attention to distances between the lines and the angles of my brush marks. By the way, the brush I'm using is just a hard round brush which has the shape dynamics and transfer options turned on in the brush settings. I find this brush is perfectly adequate for this type of drawing. Every now and then, I'll turn off my guides to see how the drawing is progressing, and if anything looks off. As the drawing progresses, mistakes will become more evident, and I'll need to adjust the guidelines and some of the marks I've made to ensure that I'm heading towards a more accurate drawing. Now that I have the basic shape of the skull down, it's time to tackle the internal details. At this point, I'll be adding more guidelines so I can accurately pinpoint different elements. It's kind of like creating a visual map for the drawing. Whilst I'm doing all of this, I'm spending more time looking at my reference than I am at the drawing, in order for me to get the drawing as accurate as possible. As well as that, I'm totally okay with having to redraw whatever is needed in service of improving the drawing as a whole. Every now and then, I'll flip the drawing to see how things look at a different angle. The longer I look at something, the less I'll notice things that are off. Oftentimes, some elements will need to be adjusted as my eye is not used to this new angle. And when I flip it back, I'll notice even more things that need to be fixed. At this point, I'm not overly concerned with the finish of the drawing. I'm more interested in how accurately I've depicted everything so far. After I'd mapped in most of the details, it was time to get started on the finer details. And I started with the teeth. I found that teeth can be especially tricky to get right, and that I have to spend more time really analyzing all the different angles and where things are in relation to others. As you'll see, there was a bit of back and forth in order for me to get these right. At this point, it was time to turn off the guides and work with just the sketch. This is where I spent some time cleaning up some of the lines and making sure that they were as close to the photo as possible. This of course involved moving some things around, and some redrawing of certain elements such as the eye sockets and nasal cavity. As well as that, I started adding in more details to the jaw and the areas around the teeth. I also started indicating where the shadows would be, as well as some light shading and cracks in the skull itself. For this stage of the drawing, I found that I needed to zoom in a little bit so as to get those finer details a bit more accurate. Drawing is a fundamental skill for all artists. I also think that the better your drawing skills are, the better your paintings are. And by that I mean the framework or foundation is better described and thought out, which will make it easier to paint with less mental math. Most of us start out by simply drawing and trying to emulate the world around us, or worlds we imagine. I think that neglecting your drawing skills is a mistake. It will not only lead to dissatisfaction with your work, but will also mean having to go back to those fundamental skills at some point down the road. My point being is that there are no shortcuts to improving, and even the most accomplished painters today and in the past still had to rely on excellent drawing skills. In part 2 of this video, I'll go through how I use this drawing to accurately represent the reference photo with a digital sketch, and how much more efficient it is to start from a solid foundation than to work on a house of cards. Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I'm Simon from Scar Illustration, and I hope you're keeping well. Today, in this second video, I'm going to talk about how I create accurate color sketches from photographs. If you'd like to watch the first video, I'll leave a link in the description below. Let's dive in. The first thing I do is tint the canvas. And I usually choose a color that's kind of a midway tone between all the colors. I don't spend too long on this, I just roughly paint it in. The reason I do this is because I find it much easier to get the colors correct than on a stark white background. For this study, I wanted to establish some of the gray tones first, and then I moved on to something approaching the strong highlight on the left side of the skull. As the skull is somewhat porous in nature, I decided to use a chalk brush to bring out some of that texture in these initial marks. Next, it was on to establishing some of the darker areas around the terminator line just above the left eye socket, as well as on the bridge of the nose, the teeth, and the chin. Once I had that down, it was a bit easier to get some of the mid-tone values right in comparison. As you can see, I'm not zooming in at all at this stage, as I want to see how the image is developing as a whole, and to make sure that the values and colors are matching. I'm also just loosely indicating where the colors are as placeholders, so that when I do a details pass, I'll know that everything is in the right place, without any additional guesswork. For the back of the skull, I decided to flip the study so as to make it a bit easier for me to get the shapes correct. I then turned off the sketch layer and roughly indicated where the main shadow would be, so I could get a sense of where it was in space. Now that all the main elements were in the right place, it was time to tackle the details. Here I spent time refining some of the shapes and getting the elements to be closer to the photo. I'm also paying close attention to the photo so as to get the subtle color differences correct, which will in turn suggest form variations in the skull. Again, I'm still fairly zoomed out so as to make sure that everything is balanced and that I don't over-render one area. At this stage, I'm still adding in different values and not really worrying about making them look pretty. Real quick, if you're enjoying the video, please consider liking and subscribing, as this will make it much easier for me to continue making this type of content. Now, back to the video. Once I got to the teeth, I decided to zoom in a bit, so as to get all the smaller shapes correct. Occasionally, I turned on the sketch layer to check that everything was still in the right place. After the teeth were basically done, I then flipped the sketch, zoomed back out a bit, and started bouncing around the skull if I noticed anything that didn't look quite right. I also started modeling some of the major forms, so that the skull would have a more 3D look to it. When it comes to blending, I don't like to soften all of the brush strokes. I think that there's a fine line between the right amount of blending and too much. I prefer to have a more painterly look to my work, which has a variety of interesting edges, as opposed to something that looks too soft or airbrushy and without a solid form. Next, I zoomed out even more so I could check the values and some of the color transitions. I also wanted to see how all the shapes were looking. and I went back over some of those that needed to be developed a bit further. After that, I zoomed back in to model the teeth a bit more. Overall, I felt that some of the edges were looking a bit too sharp, and so I softened the edges where needed and added some additional rendering. Throughout this study, I divorced myself from trying to paint a skull and instead concentrated on just painting shapes. Not only does this help with putting everything together, but it also allows me to move away from relying too much on assumed information. And by that I mean painting what I think the skull should look like as opposed to what is actually in front of me. Once all the main details were in the right place, I moved on to the finer details. And I started with the most challenging area, the teeth. I also worked on modeling the areas around the teeth. To get these areas correct, I spent a fair amount of time really analyzing the photo. Next, I moved on to the light that was coming through the thinner bone on the side of the nasal cavity. This area was one of the most interesting aspects of the photo, and I wanted to make sure that I described it as accurately as possible. Then it was time to start adding some of the reflected lights and colors into the shadow areas. I find that subtlety is the key when adding these colors. If they're too dark, light, or saturated, they just won't look right. After all, they're simply there to enhance the overall image and not command too much attention. After that, I went ahead and refined some of the edges, and I added some reflections into the main shadow areas. Once that was finished, I played around with different edge effects for the background, just to see what it would look like, as well as darkening off some areas to highlight the skull as much as possible. I also added an indication of wood grain to the cabinet the skull was sitting on, and then some subtle cracks in the skull itself, as well as some brush strokes to the edges of the skull to suggest movement in a somewhat static composition. In the end, I zoomed out, discarded the edges on the background, and just painted it out as I thought it looked better. In part 1, I highlighted the fact that I think that drawing is a fundamental skill for all artists, and that the better your drawing skills are, the better your paintings probably are, which I think I've managed to demonstrate with this sketch. Not only is this sketch accurate, but because I spent the time making sure that the underlying drawing was correct to begin with, the actual painting part went much faster and was a lot more enjoyable than if I just winged it and had to go back over things multiple times to correct them. Thanks for watching, and I hope this was helpful. And if it was, please consider liking this video and subscribe to my channel, as this will make it much easier for me to continue creating this type of content. Also, let me know if you have any questions or if there's some other aspect of painting that you'd like to see in future videos in the comments below. Have a good one, and keep on painting.
Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I'm Simon from Scar Illustration, and I hope you're keeping well. Today I'm going to talk about how the weight of expectation, comparison, and overthinking can ruin your art, and how I moved past that with my latest personal painting, The Guardian: Origin. Let's dive in. After I finished my last painting, I was excited to move on to my next piece. So I started to go through some ideas and rough sketches. I wanted to do a follow-up to another painting that I'd done in the past, The Guardian. That piece was a surprise for me, in that I had no expectations that it was going to be good. I just had a feeling about it, and went for it. I didn't think about how it was going to be received, if people were going to like it, or if it was going to go in my folio. I just had fun and went with the flow. But as I was going through the initial ideas for this new painting, I started to feel those all too familiar emotions. Time was going by and nothing seemed to be sticking, There was no obvious visual hooks for me. Nothing I could throw my weight behind. I also felt a rising pressure to create something as good, if not better, than my last painting. Something where I could show my progress in the time that had passed. I started to feel overwhelmed and an imposter. And I wasn't sure if I could emulate that magic again. Especially after completing my previous painting where I was getting mentored. And so the weight of overthinking and comparison started to kick in, and my progress with the painting started to slow down. So I took a few days off and did some other stuff. Stopped looking at social media as much, or comparing my work to other artists, and instead I watched movies that I really enjoyed, got out into nature, read some books, and after a few days I became inspired again, and was able to release the weight of expectation and worry. And then I got back to work. After those few much-needed days away, I was excited to get back to the painting. Firstly, I created an inspiration board to help me get the feel of what I wanted the painting to look like. I then quickly developed some new ideas and moved on to some color sketches. I eventually ended up going with this idea. From there, I made a crude diorama of the scene and lit it as close as I could to the sketch. I find that creating these gives me some really useful light and shadow information. And I then took photos of that, as well as reference photos of the figures in the scene. And then I went through all those photos and picked the ones that were appropriate and all fit together. After that, I compiled the other reference I needed from what I could find online. And once all that was done, I started in on the final sketch. I spent a fair amount of time getting the sketch right. I wanted the character to have the similar look and feel to the original painting, the only difference being that he was much younger. I went through my usual block-in, only with this painting I kind of went from background to foreground, which is how I used to tackle my traditional work. Moving from the sky to the architectural structure. At this point I wasn't really finessing anything too much, I just wanted to get everything in the right place, and see how it was all going to fit together as a whole. And then it was on to the stairs and the floor. The floor tiles were a little tricky to get right. They had to have a worn-in look and not look too perfect or digital. So I ended up spending a fair amount of time really studying my reference, and then giving the tiles a more distressed look to them. After that, it was on to the figures.
Real quick, if you're enjoying the video, please consider liking and subscribing, as this will make it much easier for me to continue making this type of content. Now, back to the video.
The whole idea behind this painting is that the main character has just joined the Palace Guard, and, unbeknownst to him, this is his first test. After rising before dawn, he had taken up his post on the pilot's sky platform, which is usually quiet and uneventful, perfect for a new recruit, which is why he was happy to take the shift. Unfortunately for him, a couple of the prison's recent inmates had other ideas. They too had woken before dawn, only to find their armor and weapons returned,
their cell doors unlocked, and no guards in sight. Weary of their sudden good fortune, they quickly grabbed their swords and headed out the door, up some rocky stairs, and found themselves on the famed sky platform, with only a single lowly recruit between them and freedom. When I was designing the look of the characters, I had to keep in mind some of the aesthetics that I developed with the first painting, and this certainly informed my design choices for the two prisoners. However, the main character needed to look a bit more polished, and therefore somewhat different from the other two, which is why his outfit looks more expensive and coordinated. After all the elements were blocked in, I started on the most difficult part of the painting, the main character. There are a lot of elements to get right. The musculature, the sword, torch, armor, as well as the secondary light source coming from the torch. Once the main character was about 70% done, I moved back onto the secondary characters. The one on the left seemed to be going okay, but the helmet and his right leg looked off, despite my following the reference. Rather than dwelling on it, I moved on to the second background character. I actually felt a lot more confident about this character. The pose seemed to be easier for me, and flowed a bit nicer. In order for me to get the character to look the same as the other one, I had to make a copy of the first character and move it closer, so I could reference it a bit easier on the screen. Once I had both characters in the same ballpark, it was time to move back to developing the background elements. I started with the arches. They were looking a bit too perfect, so I started developing a more distressed look to them, all the while checking my reference, and then moved on to developing the floor, before moving back to the background characters. While I was working on the architecture, I noticed that the armor on these characters needed a bit more work, as well as some of the leather elements and the blue smoke. So I took the weekend and did some studies of armor, as well as leather and smoke to support some of the other areas that I felt weren't quite there. As a result, I felt a lot more confident going back to the painting. After the background characters were done, I moved on to the second most challenging part of the painting, the blue smoke. I painted smoke in the past, but I was never really that happy with the results. So I decided to really go all in on this and see what happened. I resketched out all the smoke, added a layer of color behind it so I could see everything easier, and then started adding in all the elements. Getting this right required a lot of careful observation and spending more time looking at the reference than the painting. After I finished that, it occurred to me that the main character should probably have pauldrons, especially as the other two prisoners did. If not, he would look unprepared and at somewhat of a disadvantage. I really liked the light and shadow shapes on his shoulder and was reluctant to cover those up, but in the end I decided that I would have to add the pauldrons for the sake of believability. Getting the angles right proved to be a bit tricky, but I got there in the end after flipping the painting multiple times. While I was doing all of this, my wife walked past and casually suggested that I should crop the bottom of the picture, as there were a lot of dead space. Faceplant. I'd spent so much time looking at the painting that I'd missed this seemingly simple and yet impactful change. All through the painting I kept thinking that something was missing, that somehow it just wasn't looking quite right. And once I made this quick change, the difference was like night and day. After that, I spent some time pushing some of the contrast on the main figure and working on his face. I ended up painting his face a number of times before I got it right, and then promptly went back to the original. I then went back to the secondary figures and made some final adjustments, such as fixing the right leg on the left side character, as well as finishing up the sky elements. My main message with this video is that in order to create your best art, you need to have an open mind and let go of expectations. For example, I don't know how many times I've opened a new sketchbook or started a new painting and felt pressure to create something amazing, and for it to totally bomb. Or if I'm going to the gym and I've been working toward lifting a particular weight, but hadn't felt quite ready, hadn't slept well and didn't feel focused, and so with zero expectations had gone and lifted even more than I thought. Creating art is so much easier without the weight of expectation, overthinking, and comparison. Stop chasing the likes and the approvals, just have faith, stay loose, and go for it. You'll be surprised how much better your work will look, and how much more enjoyable the whole process will be. I know, it feels counterintuitive, but that's how the universe works. The more you want something, the less likely it's going to happen. Once you relax about it, the universe will hand it to you. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm Simon from Sky Illustration, and I hope you're keeping well. Today, I'm excited to talk about a topic that has been a game changer for me: how to boost your productivity and paint faster. All this will unfold over a time lapse of a recent sketch I completed titled Salt Rock Road Crew. Let's dive in. Over the years, I've experimented with countless strategies to try and optimize my productivity. And I've wrestled with the constant balancing act of creativity and time management. In my younger days, I would often burn the midnight oil, staying up late to finish pieces and then sleeping in the next day. While this seemed like a good idea at the time, it always left me feeling rushed and slightly out of sync. My rhythm was off, my energy levels were unpredictable, and as a result, my progress was sluggish. And then I decided to flip the script and tried waking up earlier. And sure, on days when I'd had a good night's sleep, it was great. But more often than not, I found myself groggy, yawning endlessly, and struggling to focus, even after several cups of coffee. And I'd literally be in the same boat as I was when I got up late. Eventually, after much trial and error, I discovered my own rhythm. Now I wake up at a reasonable time, which for me is around 6 a.m., and that's my sweet spot. After my usual morning routine of meditation, shower, and a solid breakfast, I'm ready to start working by 7:30 or 8 a.m. For me, the golden hours for productivity are in the morning and early afternoon. This is when my mind is sharpest and my creativity flows more naturally. I've noticed that during this time of the day, I can achieve more in a few focused hours than I would in an entire day if I started late. I feel more in control, less stressed, and the work just seems to come together more effortlessly. Well, most of the time. However, as the day progresses and I inch closer to lunchtime, I notice my energy levels wane. By early afternoon, my mind tends to wander, and I become easily distracted and restless. It's like hitting a creative dead zone, so I've learned not to push myself too much during those hours. Instead, I use this time for less demanding tasks like answering emails, researching potential clients, or fitting in some exercise. After that, I kind of get my second wind and I'm able to get back into the swing of things. And most days I'll work till around 7:30 or 8 o'clock at night. But here's the thing, productivity isn't a one-size-fits-all. What works for me might not work for you. I know plenty of artists who are night owls, finding their creative spark in the afternoons and the evenings. The key is to discover your own natural rhythm, understand when you're at your best, and align your work schedule accordingly. Back when I had a full-time job, finding time for art was a challenge. Between commuting, working out, socializing, and running errands, my only available hours were in the evenings and on weekends. And this went on for years. It was tough, often frustrating, especially when I felt like I was spending my most productive hours at a job that wasn't aligned with my passion. But I knew that if I wanted to transition to being a freelance illustrator, I just had to make it work. Preparation has become the cornerstone of my painting process. It's something that I can't emphasize enough. It's crucial. In the past, I would jump straight into a painting, eager to bring my ideas to life. But more often than not, I'd hit roadblocks early on. I didn't see the value in spending time on preliminary steps like color studies or gathering reference materials. I just wanted to paint. But this approach led to frustration. And the final pieces rarely matched the vision I had in my head. The process was slow, with lots of backtracking to fix issues that I could have avoided with better preparation. Over time, I developed a more structured approach that has drastically improved my workflow. These days, I follow a set of predetermined steps to ensure that when I start painting, the process is as smooth as possible. Here's what my preparation looks like. I start out by sketching as many ideas in the form of thumbnails as possible, making sure I've explored every creative avenue. Then I'll write a quick backstory and motivation from the main character or characters, adding depth and context to the piece. Then I'll create an inspiration board to capture the overall feel, elements, and the characters I want in the piece. I'll then do value sketches to determine the light sources and ensure they enhance the focal points. After that, I'll explore different color palettes to find the best fit for the scene. Then I'll gather all the relevant references, as well as take my own photos to get the exact details I need. For complex scenes, I might create a makeshift model or maquette to get the lighting and shadows just right. Finally, I'll create a detailed sketch that serves as the foundation for the painting. With all these elements in place, I approach the painting with confidence, knowing that I've set myself up for success. Of course, things can still go wrong, but the likelihood of major issues is much lower when I've taken the time to prepare properly. Once all the prep work is done, it's time to execute. I now have all the information I need, and I'm working during the hours when I'm at my creative peak. This combination allows me to paint faster and with greater confidence. Starting with a solid foundation means I can maintain momentum without having to stop and figure things out mid-process. This continuity is key to speeding up the painting process. And as I move through the piece, my enthusiasm builds, driving me to keep pushing forward, even when fatigue sets in, or it gets late. In many ways, it's like binge watching a great TV show on Netflix. You're so invested in seeing how it all turns out that you just want to keep going. And that's how I feel when I'm deep into a painting, eager to see the final outcome. So, there you have it, my approach to painting faster and being more productive. It's all about finding your rhythm, preparing thoroughly, and executing with confidence. Remember, what works for me may not work for everyone, but hopefully some of these insights can help you find your own path to greater productivity and creative satisfaction.
Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm Simon from Scar Illustration, and I hope you're keeping well. Today, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. A paint over of an older painting of mine, just for fun. Let's dive in. Back in the day, when I created this particular painting, I was transitioning from traditional oil painting to digital painting. So I started off using Painter. My reasoning was that Painter was specifically designed for digital painting, and as such could do a number of things that Photoshop could not at the time. I also found Painter had a lot of options that other painting programs didn't. From brushes, papers, canvases, and different ways to mix paint. Which was good and bad. Bad in that it was a little overwhelming for someone just getting into digital painting. There was just too many options to choose from. And so soon after I finished this painting, I decided to move back over to Photoshop, which has been my mainstay ever since. I haven't looked at this painting in some time, and now that I am, I can see a number of things that need to be fixed. First off, all the colors are way too saturated. There's no sense of depth or volume. Then there's the vague and somewhat impressionistic background. The undefined ground area that the character is kneeling on. And they're just plain weird anatomy. I mean, I get that it's a monster of some description, but at the same time, it needs to look like the limbs actually work. So, the first order of business was to separate out the character from the background with a quick path. After that, I filled in the background area where the character was, and started to add some more details. Once those were in, I messed around with the saturation levels, to give the background a sense of depth, which the original didn't seem to have at all, as well as some subtle colorings. After that, I moved back onto the figure, made a quick mask, and filled it with black. Changed the blend mode to multiply, and then added a gradient, so that the bottom of the figure would be darker than the top, which is where I want the focal point to be. I then took a chalk brush and removed some of the black from the ground area, to add some light and texture there. I then went back to the figure and added some darker tones to the sides and other areas, to suggest volume, as the original figure felt a bit flat. Then I spent a bit of time defining the bones in the background, and the ground area itself. I added some details to suggest rocks, stones, and some old dead tree roots. Then back to the figure, and I started working on his eyes. As I was never that happy with how they looked on the original. I then went ahead and remodeled his facial features, as well as his teeth, which needed to be more defined, so that they would be a bit easier to read, while was remembering to flip the painting to see how everything was looking. Then it was on to his left arm and shoulder area. I felt that the original shoulder was too low for the angle of his torso, so I duplicated that and moved it up to be more in line with the other shoulder, and then painted over that. Then I bounced over to the background and indicated a subtle mountain range to give the viewer some idea of the environment, as well as defining some of the clouds, before continuing with the figure's shoulder and upper arm area. Then I moved on to the forearm and claw. This was another one of those parts of the painting that I felt needed more information or definition. On the original, the claw is this kind of bulbous mass that didn't really make a lot of sense, so I went ahead and started indicating something that was a bit easier for the viewer to understand. Then I moved on to the other arm. I decided to extend this arm as it felt a bit too short overall, and not in the right place anatomically. I also added a shoulder, which was previously missing on the original. And then I moved on to the claw fingers. Again, these weren't really defined in my mind, so I started asking myself questions like, do they articulate like an actual hand? Or are they static? And if they are static, why are they shaped like that? Did they once articulate, but no longer do? Due to some injury or other reason? As you can see, I initially tried replacing the claws with an actual hand. But after drawing a couple of options, I decided that it didn't really seem to fit with the character. I then moved on to more of a static hook design, and added some details to that, before settling with a more simplistic blade, as the hook wasn't really working either. While I was deciding on how to move forward with the blade, I moved back to the background to add some definition to the clouds and mountains. I let my mind percolate on that little problem. Then I moved back to the figure and started to render out his other shoulder and belly areas, before finally moving back to the blade. It still wasn't quite there, so I went through a number of different options. And while I was working on that, I noticed some other areas that needed to be fixed, such as the claws on his feet and the other arm claw. I then went back to his shoulder and moved up some of the musculature, as it felt a bit too low. Then I bumped up the values on his eyes as they were getting kind of lost, and added some details to his foot. After that, it was time to add some of the final details, such as the blood splatter and some reflected lights in the shadow areas. It was fun to look back at one of my older paintings and see all the ways, subtle and more obvious, that I would do things differently today. A lot of the time, I kind of feel like I'm not actually progressing at all, but it's when I look at some of my older work that I can really see the progress that I've made.
Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm Simon from Scar Illustration, and I hope you're keeping well. Today I'm going to talk about how to paint smoke in a realistic way. Let's dive in. When I was creating this painting, I needed to learn how to paint smoke convincingly. I'd painted smoke before, of course, but I was never really that happy with the way it looked. Somehow I wasn't really buying the end results. So I hopped onto YouTube and started looking for tutorials. And surprisingly, there weren't that many. The ones that I did find weren't really all that informative, or they were just too basic and not realistic enough for what I was after. Undeterred, I went and had a look at how some other artists that I admire had painted smoke, and I spent some time studying those paintings. I then gathered some reference on smoke and put together a photo montage that I could use as a basis for the smoke in my painting. I added a layer with a flat color above my painting so that I could clearly see what I was doing without having the underlying painting getting in the way. After that, I sketched out how I wanted the smoke to look, which was based on the reference photos. For the sketch, I opted to use an actual color, as opposed to just black or gray, so as to make it a bit easier to see the sketch when painting. Once the sketch was done, it was time to start the base layer. As this is a fantasy painting, the smoke needed to look magical, which is why I started with a blue color. Using a soft airbrush, I started to carefully paint in the overall shape of the smoke, adding more paint to certain areas than others, and ignoring other areas completely. To emulate the translucency of the smoke, as the sketch is somewhat complicated, I was spending more time looking at the reference than my painting. I think this is crucial when trying to emulate anything, and a mistake that I used to make when I was starting out. Back in the day, I would have the reference in front of me, but would prefer to just look at it sparingly, and I would end up with less than optimal results, and some of that looked ultimately unbelievable. I also think this applies to all styles of painting, not just representational art. Because even if you're doing something more stylized, or even impressionistic, you'll still need to have as much information as possible, so you know what to keep and what to leave out. As I'm going through this stage of the painting, I make sure to turn off the sketch layer every now and then, and zoom out to see how things are progressing, and to make sure that it's heading in the direction that I want. Once the base layer was kind of done, it was time to start adding the more definition to the smoke. For this, I turned off the base layer so I could see the sketch easier, added a new layer, and selected a much smaller brush. And after studying the reference, I started applying paint. For the most part, I was following the sketch lines, but there were some areas where I needed to really study the reference, so as to get the brush strokes in all the right places. Once these brush strokes were in place, I turned the base layer back on and started to accentuate different areas, as well as knocking back other parts, whilst paying close attention to the reference. I made sure not to rush during this stage, so that I wouldn't miss anything. I was also moving from the definition layer to the base layer constantly, as I was developing the smoke. Once that stage was complete, I removed the flat color layer to see how the smoke was fitting in with the rest of the painting. I then turned off those layers and added another one underneath, as I wanted to add a soft blue cloud effect to the smoke. Zooming out to check how it was all looking at regular intervals. For this, I opted to use the cloud brush, because I wanted the mark making to be a bit more random. I know that some artists are against using brushes such as this, and while I agree that using a texture brush is no substitute for understanding what you're painting, I also think that for some things, these types of brushes are ideal. If this was a traditional painting, I'd be using different brushes and techniques to get the effects that I needed, and I see this as no different. Once the basic shape was completed, I made a quick mask and went back in with a soft airbrush to break up the shape for more visual interest and to get away from the repetitiveness of the cloud brush. As the overall shape wasn't quite fitting with the other layers, I used the Warp Transform tool to make the changes that were needed, and then went on to add some more subtle smoke wisps to the bottom of the painting. So to sum up, I would say that in order to paint smoke convincingly, I used a layer with a more subtle cloud, which adds more opaqueness to the smoke overall. On top of that, a layer which has the soft wisps of smoke for the general shape. And a final layer with smaller brushstrokes, which is more opaque, to emphasize the definition of the smoke.
Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm Simon from Scar Illustration, and I hope you're keeping well. Today I'm going to talk about how to paint drapery in a realistic way. Let's dive in. Before I start painting any type of drapery, I make sure that I have good reference to work from. And I'll spend a bit of time really looking closely at that reference before I get going on the actual painting. I'll notice where the light sources are, where the form shadows are, where the shadow areas of the folds, where the cast shadows are, and the movement of the drapery. For example, is it hanging straight down, wrapping around something, bowed, or perhaps just crumpled up on the floor? The thing about drapery is that it has no real form of its own, and so it's completely dependent on whatever it's covering up. So when I'm observing and painting drapery, I have to keep in mind the underlying structure and make sure that the folds suggest that structure and that they are in the right place. Next, I'll start with a base tone for the drapery. And this is usually a mid-tone color. When I'm painting drapery, or anything really, I tend to focus more on the value scale, which is the range of lights and darks, rather than getting the colors perfect to begin with. Everything in painting has a value structure, which indicates depth and gives the structure dimension. I like to use a pretty simple value scale to start off, which is usually 5 tones. The darkest dark, mid-dark, mid-tone, mid-light, and the lightest light. I know that a lot of other artists will use a much larger value scale than this, but I found that this is perfectly fine for me to get started, because I don't want to get overwhelmed and overthink things too much. Plus, I know that as the painting progresses, there will be more subtle value changes that I'll add on. Once the base tone is down, I'll start indicating what the mid-darks are as a crude roadmap. I don't rush this, as I want this to be as accurate as possible, so I don't have to go back over and repaint anything that's incorrect later. Once the mid-darks are in, I'll move on to the mid-lights, which, like the mid-darks, is a tone that is in between the mid-tone and the lightest light. Again, I'll take my time rather than rushing and making mistakes. Now that these tones are in, I can roughly see how everything looks, and if there's any adjustments that need to be made. I'll flip the painting to see if there's any glaring mistakes that I've missed, as well as continue painting on the flipped version. I'll also turn the sketch layer on and off to check to see if everything is in the right place. If all's good, I'll move ahead with the darkest darks and the lightest lights. For this particular character, I added a gold trim to his outfit. For this, I added a new layer, created a layer mask by hovering the cursor between the 2 layers and press the Alt key. This will make sure that anything I paint on the new layer will be clipped to the bottom layer, and then painted in all the gold areas. Once done, I changed the blend mode to color, and then duplicated that layer, changed the blend mode to color dodge, and reduced the opacity. And because I'd already painted in all the details, shadows and highlights, I didn't have to repaint all of that again with the new gold layers. The drapery on this second character is somewhat different from the first, in that this drapery is not wrapping around the character, but is instead being dragged up a staircase, heavy with blood. And so the folds will be quite different. As well as that, there's other elements resting on top of the drapery, which is adding some interesting cast shadows. For the drapery on this character, I again started with a mid-tone as a base for the overall shape. This time I also added a general lighting guide, which served as rough mid-darks. I then put in some mid-lights on the upper portion of the train of the fabric, as well as changing the sketch layer to a white color so I could see it a bit easier. Then it was a case of getting the balance right between these two tones. After that, I moved on to the bottom portion of the train. As the base color is quite dark, I started with mid-lights instead, and then added in the mid-darks, and bounced between the two. With whatever method or process I use, I'm always open to changing things if the need arises. And again, I made sure that I had a really good reference for this before I started sketching and painting. While I'm painting this drapery, I made sure to keep in mind the staircase underneath by checking my guides, reference, and my sketch. I also zoomed out to see how things were looking as a whole. After the mid-darks and lights were in, I then spent some time refining the shapes, both with the sketch layer turned off and on, until I was happy with how it all looked. So the takeaways from this video are, in order to paint drapery convincingly, make sure to use good reference, really look at the values and pay less attention to colors in the beginning stages. Observe where the light sources are and how that will affect how the lights and darks will fall. Notice where form and cast shadows are. Look at the flow or the rhythm of the fabric. Use an accurate base sketch to work from. And keep in mind that fabric has no form of its own, but is completely dependent on what it's covering. For further reference, I'd suggest looking at Drawing the Draped Figure by George B. Bridgman. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm Simon from Scar Illustration, and I hope you're keeping well. Today I'm going to talk about the one thing that makes all the difference with your art, and it's not what you think. Let's dive in. This video is going to be a little bit different, in that I'm not going to talk about specific techniques, hacks to improve your workflow, or fundamental artistic skills. But instead, I'm going to talk about the one most important thing you must have to be successful, and that is the love. And by that I mean you have to love what you're doing and creating. Because if you don't bring the love, the excitement, and the enthusiasm, then it will show through in your work, every time. Creativity begins in the mind, as an idea or a concept that you'd like to bring to life, and from there to your hand, and finally the canvas. So if there isn't any enthusiasm or excitement in your mind at the start of the process, then you can't really expect the painting to exude that either. The body will always follow the mind. You may have heard that people can tell whether or not an artist was fully engaged when they created a painting. And I totally believe that, because it's happened to me a few times. For example, I've worked on illustrations in the past that I wasn't really that interested in. The process would be a real slog. I would procrastinate, find excuses not to get on with the painting, and I would have trouble getting into the zone. I would have to literally drag myself over to my desk to work on it, if at all. Once I'd finished the painting, I would feel dissatisfied with the results, almost immediately. And sometimes I would scratch my head and wonder why. My process was the same as usual. Technically, the paintings would be fine, and I made sure that I had all the reference that I needed, except for one vital thing. There was little to no love or life in the painting. And if I put those paintings next to one of my favorite paintings that I poured my heart and soul into, then it became very clear very quickly which one I enjoyed painting more. Because that feeling, that enthusiasm, that love comes through in the work every single time. There will be times, either as a freelance artist, an aspiring artist, or hobbyist, where you'll be asked to paint something that you're less than excited about. And depending on your circumstances, or where you are in your career, you'll either inwardly groan and accept the commission, because you have to, or you'll walk away because you can. So the question is, if you have to create the illustration, how do you instill that feeling into the work? How do you enjoy creating something that you really don't care for? How do you bring the love? And my answer to that is, forget about the subject matter, forget about how much you're getting paid, if you are, forget about the deadline, and concentrate on the basics: the composition, the colors, the flow, the lighting, the shapes. Once you do this and start going through the process, you'll find something that will spark your interest. Maybe it's that dynamic sliver of light, the textures on those mountains, a certain character's pose, how the background and the foreground interact with each other, or working on something that's a weak point in your artistic arsenal. Whatever it is, find it, hone in on it, and use it to fuel that fire of enthusiasm. And once that fire has started, it'll spread throughout the entire painting. And suddenly, you've shifted your mindset from reluctance, despondency, and low energy to excitement, enthusiasm, and high energy. And this will begin to shine through in your painting immediately, because you'll be looking at it through fresh eyes, seeing things that you'd missed before, and looking forward to expressing what you wanted to in that painting. Some of the most celebrated paintings, and artists for that matter, are not the best technically, or have the most complicated paintings, or have rendered everything perfectly. But they all have that one thing that makes them shine brighter than the rest. That one thing that really connects with their audience, and that's the excitement, enthusiasm, and love that the artist brought to the table, and we're happy to share with the world. And once you find that, your paintings will begin to improve.
Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm Simon from Scar Illustration, and I hope you're keeping well. In this video, I'm going to go through my 5 proven tips for creating your best art in 2025. Stick around until the end, as I have an additional 3 bonus tips to share. Let's dive in. As simple as it may sound, this is really important. Your eyes will get used to how something looks over time, and mistakes will go unnoticed. But once you flip your art, any mistakes that are there will become glaringly obvious. So obvious that you'll wonder why you didn't see them before. With that in mind, I would suggest flipping your art at least every 1 to 2 hours, so you can spot those mistakes faster and avoid having to do any repainting. And you'll also get a fresh perspective on your work. In my experience, in order to get good results with illustrative work, you need as much information as possible. And this means using good reference. Most people are able to recognize fairly quickly if something is off on a painting, be it a face, hands, or a pose, because these are things that most people see on a regular basis. If you're drawing your information simply from imagination, then there will always be gaps in that information, and it will be instantly noticeable. Now, this goes for all styles of art, from photoreal to the most stylized, because it doesn't matter how the piece was finished, you will still need all the info you can get in order to decide what to keep in and what to keep out. The other thing I'd like to mention is to create your own reference wherever possible.
rather than relying on images that you found online or in books, etc. Not only will it be much more specific to your piece, but you'll be able to have a lot more control on the information that you have, thereby making the painting process that much easier, rather than having to do a ton of mental math to make it work. I must admit that I've been guilty of this many times in the past, whereby I would focus too much on one area of detail and spend way too much time trying to get an area to look perfect, only to find that when I zoomed out, that it would look odd and unbalanced with the rest of the piece. I found that by zooming in to a maximum of 100%, that I'm forced to not over-detail areas that will more likely be missed by the viewer. As well as that, you'll be able to judge how much detail to really include, so as to balance the painting as a whole. On top of that, the painting process will go much faster, because you're not spending endless hours on details that, in the end, will not add that much to the piece, and as a result, you'll find the process to be more enjoyable as a whole. It's pretty common to feel more pressure when working on a final piece. Unfortunately, this will translate into how the painting will look in the end. The more stressed you are, the less likely the piece will have the energy and flow that perhaps the color sketch had. And you'll end up with something that feels stiff and unappealing. You'll also find that the actual painting experience is nowhere near as enjoyable. I know that this is easier said than done, especially if the piece is for a new client or perhaps for your folio. But it is important to keep this in mind to get the results that you want. Remember to have faith in your abilities and trust the process. Do that and all will be well. Again, this is something that I've definitely ignored in the past. Taking short breaks throughout the painting process is essential. Not only will you get more done in a shorter space of time, but every time you do come back to the painting, you'll have fresh eyes on it. And you'll be able to tackle any issues that much faster. When I was starting out, I thought that this advice was unimportant. For me, it seemed somewhat counterintuitive. But as time has passed, I've come to realize that taking short breaks really does make a difference to the quality of work that I can get done in a specific time frame, and to how long the process takes overall. I think that looking at other artists' work that you admire is invaluable. Not only is it inspiring, but it's also a good way to increase your visual vocabulary. And subconsciously, you'll start to add some of the things that resonated with you into your own work. Saying that, I don't think it's a good idea to spend endless hours comparing your work to others. Every artist is on their own unique journey and on their own timeline. So I think it's best to think of it as some artists are further along in their journey and other artists are a bit further down the road, rather than who's better than who. Focus more on your own artistic journey and what you want to achieve with your art, because ultimately that's the most important thing. I've been caught out on this one a couple of times, whereby I thought I'd finished the painting and set it aside, only to come back to it a day or two later and see that there were a few things that still needed to be tweaked. This tip kind of compounds on my earlier tip about taking breaks. Whenever you finish a painting, there will always be a couple of things that will need extra attention. And to most people, it won't make much difference. But it will to you, because it'll be the difference between feeling confident about your work or feeling kinda ho-hum about the piece. My final tip is to stop trying to do everything, because you'll end up being a jack of all trades and a master of none. And just focus on the type of art that you really enjoy creating, because this will come through in your art, and the people that look at it will sense that. Now, this may not always be the work that you really admire, but it's imperative that you do the work that you really love, rather than overextending and trying to do everything. It's kind of like going to a buffet or a restaurant where they have every type of cuisine imaginable. But in the end, none of it is really that appetizing or tastes that great. To me, the most memorable artists are those that focus their energies on what really fires them up, so that they can create their best work. Hope this was helpful, and let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Please consider liking this video and subscribe to my channel. Have a good one, and keep on painting.